Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the past in gentle, soothing detail to help you drift into peaceful rest. I'm your host, and tonight we're embarking on a journey along one of history's most remarkable networks of trade routes, the Silk Road. For the episode, we'll travel through time and across continents, exploring the merchants, the cities, the goods, and the empires that made the Silk Road possible. Let the rhythm of history carry you away as we trace the footsteps of countless traders who crossed deserts, mountains, and steppes in search of fortune and connection. So settle in and let's begin our journey. Part 1. The Origins and Early Beginnings. The Silk Road was never a single road. It was a vast network of interconnected trade routes stretching over 7,000 kilometers, linking the ancient civilizations of China in the east with the Mediterranean world in the west. The name itself is relatively modern, coined by German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, yet the routes existed for well over 1,500 years before anyone thought to give them a collective name. To understand the Silk Road, we must first travel back to the 2nd century before the Common Era, to the Han Dynasty of China, which ruled from 206 BCE to 220 CE. It was during this period that the foundations for what would become the Silk Road were truly established, though trade along portions of these routes had existed for centuries prior. The year was 138 BCE. Emperor Wu of Han, who reigned from 141 to 87 BCE, dispatched an envoy named Zhang Qian on a diplomatic mission that would inadvertently open up the routes we now call the Silk Road. Zhang Qian's original purpose was not trade, but rather to form an alliance with a people known as the Yuezhi against the threatening Zhongnu Confederation that harassed China's northwestern borders. Zhang Qian's journey was arduous. He was captured by the Xiongnu and held prisoner for 10 years before escaping. Despite this setback, he continued his mission, eventually reaching the Yuezhi in Bactria, in what is now northern Afghanistan. Though his diplomatic mission ultimately failed, the alliance he sought never materialized, Zhang Qian returned to China in 126 BCE with invaluable information about the lands to the west. He brought back detailed accounts of sophisticated civilizations, magnificent cities, and exotic goods that were unknown in China. He described the Fergana Valley, famous for its heavenly horses, powerful steeds that the Chinese desired for their military campaigns. He told of Sogdiana, with its prosperous trading cities. He described Bactria and Parthia, great kingdoms with advanced cultures and abundant resources. Emperor Wu was fascinated by these reports, the possibilities for trade, the potential for new alliances, and the strategic advantages of knowing about these distant lands captured his imagination. In 119 BCE, Zhang Qian was sent on a second expedition, this time to make contact with various kingdoms in the western regions. Though Zhang Qian himself died shortly after returning from this second journey, the pathways he had explored and the connections he had initiated would grow into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The Chinese called these western territories Shiyu, meaning western regions. The Han Dynasty began to establish military garrisons and administrative outposts along these routes, protecting traders and asserting Chinese influence. By 102 BCE, Chinese control extended as far as the Tarim Basin, a vast depression in what is now Xinjiang province, surrounded by some of the world's highest mountain ranges. But what was being traded? Silk, of course, was the most famous commodity, and it was the Chinese monopoly on silk production that made it so valuable. The secret of sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms, and the production of silk was zealously guarded by the Chinese for centuries. Silk was lightweight, extremely valuable relative to its weight, and could survive the long journey across thousands of kilometers. A single bolt of silk could make a merchant's fortune. According to legend, silk was discovered around 2700 BCE by Empress Leizu, wife of the Yellow Emperor. Whether or not this story is true, archaeological evidence confirms that the Chinese were producing silk by at least 3000 BCE. By the time of the Han Dynasty, silk production had become a sophisticated industry. The process began with the cultivation of mulberry trees, the sole food source for silkworms. The silkworms, actually the larvae of the moth Bombyx mori, would spin cocoons made of a single continuous thread of raw silk, sometimes over 900 meters long. These cocoons would be carefully collected, and the silk threads would be unwound, a process called reeling. Multiple threads would be twisted together to create a stronger yarn, which would then be woven into fabric. The resulting material was unlike anything produced elsewhere in the ancient world. It was smooth, lustrous, strong, yet incredibly light, and could be dyed in brilliant colours. Roman writers described silk with wonder and fascination. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, complained about the Roman appetite for silk, noting that it drained Roman gold eastward. He estimated that India, China, and Arabia cost the Roman Empire 100 million sesterces annually in trade, with silk being a major component. But the Silk Road carried much more than silk. From China came porcelain, lacquerware, spices like cinnamon and ginger, tea in later periods, and various manufactured goods. From the west came wool, linen, gold, silver, precious stones, glassware, and wine. From Central Asia came horses, jade, and various animal products. From India came gems, pearls, indigo dye, cotton fabrics, spices, and exotic woods. The routes themselves were challenging. Traders had to cross the formidable Taklamakan Desert, whose name allegedly means "go in and you won't come out" in the Uyghur language. They traversed the Pamir Mountains, known as the roof of the world, with passes reaching heights of over 4,500 meters. They endured extreme temperatures, from scorching summer heat to bitter winter cold. Most merchants didn't travel the entire length of the Silk Road. Instead, goods would pass through many hands, with different merchants specializing in different segments of the journey. A Chinese merchant might sell silk to a Sogdian trader in the Tarim Basin. The Sogdian would transport it westward to Merv or Samarkand, where a Persian merchant might purchase it. The Persian might carry it to Antioch, where a Greek or Roman trader might finally bring it to the Mediterranean world. This relay system had advantages. Merchants specialized in their regions, understanding local languages, customs, and dangers. They knew which oasis towns were safe, which mountain passes were open at different times of year, and where to find food, water, and shelter. But this system also meant that goods became more expensive with each transaction, as each merchant along the way added their markup. Cities along the Silk Road became wealthy from this trade. They charged taxes on goods passing through, provided services to merchants and their caravans, and often became manufacturing centers themselves. Some of the most important of these cities emerged in the oases surrounding the Taklamakan Desert, forming what became known as the Tarim Basin city-states. Kashgar, located at the western edge of the Tarim Basin, was one of the most significant of these oasis cities. Situated at the foot of the Pamir Mountains, Kashgar was where the northern and southern routes around the Taklamakan Desert converged. Merchants arriving from the east had to decide whether to take the northern route through cities like Turpan and Kucha, or the southern route through Khotan and Yarkand. Those arriving from the west, having crossed the mountains, would rest and resupply in Kashgar before continuing eastward. Turpan, on the northern route, sits in a depression that drops to 154 meters below sea level, making it one of the lowest places in the world. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the area developed sophisticated irrigation systems called caravans, underground channels that brought water from the mountains without losing it to evaporation. These systems, some of which still function today, allowed agriculture to flourish in an otherwise arid environment. Khotan, on the southern route, became famous for jade, which was mined in the nearby Kunlun Mountains. According to legend, Khotan was also where the secret of silk production first leaked out of China. The story goes that a Chinese princess, marrying a Khotan prince around the 4th century CE, smuggled silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds out of China in her elaborate headdress, despite the death penalty for such an act. Whether true or not, silk production did eventually spread beyond China's borders. Dunhuang, at the eastern edge of the Tarim Basin, served as the last major Chinese outpost before the desert. Here, merchants would rest and prepare for the difficult journey ahead. Dunhuang would later become famous for the Mogao Caves, a complex of Buddhist cave temples filled with magnificent art and, in one sealed chamber discovered in 1900, tens of thousands of manuscripts dating from the 4th to 11th centuries CE. These documents, written in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, and other languages, provide invaluable insights into life along the Silk Road. The Sogdians deserve special mention in any history of the Silk Road. This Iranian people, based in the region of modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, became the premier merchants of the Silk Road during the period from roughly the 4th to 8th centuries CE. Their cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Panjikent, among others, were cosmopolitan centres where people of many cultures met and traded. The Sogdians were polyglots, often speaking Chinese, various Iranian languages, Turkic languages, and sometimes Greek or Latin. They established merchant colonies in cities across Central Asia and even within China itself. In the Chinese capital of Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, there was a substantial Sogdian community by the 6th century CE. These Sogdian merchants served as crucial intermediaries, translating not just languages, but also cultural practices and business customs. Sogdian was, for a time, the lingua franca of the Silk Road, much as English is for international business today. Even in regions where Sogdians were a small minority, merchants would conduct business in Sogdian because it was the language everyone involved in long-distance trade was expected to know. Sogdian documents have been found from Hungary in the west to China in the east, testament to the extent of their commercial network. The Sogdians also played a crucial role in spreading religions along the Silk Road. Many Sogdians were Zoroastrians, followers of one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, founded by the prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, sometime between 1500 and 1000 BCE. Zoroastrianism emphasized the cosmic struggle between good and evil, between Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. Fire was sacred in Zoroastrianism, seen as a symbol of purity and the presence of the divine. But the Sogdians were remarkably tolerant and practical when it came to religion. While many maintained Zoroastrian practices, they were also among the earliest converts to Buddhism, Christianity, and later Islam. Sogdian communities could be found practicing various religions, sometimes in the same city. This religious flexibility made them ideal intermediaries in a world where religious identity could be as important as political allegiance. Let's pause for a moment and consider the physical reality of travel on the Silk Road. Imagine you are a merchant in the 5th century CE, preparing to join a caravan heading west from China. You would not travel alone. The dangers were too great. Bandits operated in the mountains and deserts, and wild animals posed a constant threat. Instead, you would join a caravan, perhaps numbering anywhere from a few dozen to several hundred people. Your primary means of transport would be the Bactrian camel, the two-humped camel native to Central Asia. These remarkable animals could carry loads of up to 200 kilograms and could survive for days without water, drawing on the fat reserves stored in their humps. They could withstand both the freezing cold of mountain passes and the scorching heat of the desert. Their wide, padded feet prevented them from sinking into sand or snow. For the Silk Road, they were indispensable. A typical day of travel would begin before dawn. The caravan would move during the cooler hours, resting during the heat of midday if crossing desert regions. Progress was slow by modern standards, perhaps 25 to 35 kilometers per day under good conditions, less in difficult terrain. A journey from Chang'an to Kashgar, a distance of about 4,000 kilometers, might take 3 to 4 months under favourable conditions. Caravanserais, rest stops built along the major routes, provided shelter, food and security. These structures, basically fortified inns, typically consisted of a square or rectangular enclosure with a single, easily defended entrance. Inside, there would be a large courtyard where animals could be kept, surrounded by rooms where merchants could sleep and store their goods. Caravanserais were usually spaced about 30 to 40 kilometers apart, a day's journey. Some caravanserais were simple structures offering basic shelter. Others, particularly those in major cities or at crucial junctures in the trade routes, were elaborate complexes with baths, shops, and even entertainment. The most impressive might have gardens, fountains, and richly decorated interiors. Staying at a caravanserai usually involved paying a small fee, and in return you received relative safety and the company of other travellers, from whom you could learn valuable information about conditions ahead. The dangers of the journey were real and constant. Sandstorms could arise suddenly in the desert, reducing visibility to zero and burying unwary travellers. In the mountains, avalanches and rock slides were constant threats. Extreme temperatures could kill, both the intense heat of summer deserts and the brutal cold of winter mountain passes. Water sources had to be known precisely, as running out of water in the desert was a death sentence. Then there were human dangers. Bandits knew the trade routes, as well as legitimate merchants, and would ambush caravans at vulnerable points. Local rulers might demand excessive taxes or tolls. Political instability could close routes entirely. Wars between kingdoms or empires could make entire regions impassable. The rise or fall of a single dynasty could redirect trade flows across thousands of kilometers. Despite these dangers, the profits could be enormous. A merchant who successfully transported goods from one end of the Silk Road to the other could expect to multiply their initial investment many times over. Silk purchased in China for a given price might sell in Rome for 10 or even 20 times that amount. The risks were high, but so were the potential rewards. Part 2. The Classical Period. The period from roughly the 1st century BCE to the 5th century CE is often considered the classical age of the Silk Road. During this time, several powerful empires existed simultaneously, bringing stability and prosperity to large regions and facilitating trade. In the east, the Han Dynasty reached its peak, followed by a period of fragmentation, then reunification under the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century. In the west, the Roman Empire reached its greatest extent under Emperor Trajan in the 2nd century CE. In between, various kingdoms rose and fell: the Parthian Empire, succeeded by the Sasanian Empire in Persia, the Kushan Empire in Central Asia and northern India, and various smaller kingdoms and city-states. The Han Dynasty's control of the Silk Road routes was never absolute, but it was significant. The Chinese established the 4 garrisons, military outposts at strategic locations in the Tarim Basin. These were at Kucha, Khotan, Kashgar, and Karashar. Chinese soldiers stationed at these garrisons protected traders, maintained order, and asserted Han authority over the region. The government's interest in the Silk Road was not purely economic. Control of these routes was also strategic. The Xiongnu, the nomadic confederation that had long threatened China's northern borders, could be outflanked and weakened by Chinese alliances with Western kingdoms. The famous horses of Fergana, taller and stronger than Chinese breeds, were crucial for China's cavalry. Securing a steady supply of these horses required maintaining the trade routes. Emperor Wu of Han was particularly obsessed with obtaining these heavenly horses. According to Chinese records, he sent an envoy to the kingdom of Daiwan, Fergana, to request horses. When the Ferganans refused or could not supply enough horses to satisfy Chinese demands, Emperor Wu launched a military campaign in 104 BCE. After initial setbacks, a second expedition in 102 BCE successfully besieged the Ferganan capital and secured a promise of annual horse tributes. This incident illustrates an important aspect of the Silk Road. It was never purely commercial. Politics, military concerns, and trade were always intertwined. The same routes that carried silk also carried armies, ambassadors, and intelligence. A kingdom's position on the Silk Road could determine its prosperity, its security, and its very survival. The Parthian Empire, which controlled much of modern-day Iran and Iraq from 247 BCE to 224 CE, sat astride the central section of the Silk Road. The Parthians understood the value of their position and worked to maintain it. They served as middlemen between Rome and China, and they had little interest in allowing direct contact between these two empires, as that might cut them out of profitable trade. Roman sources suggest that the Parthians deliberately exaggerated the dangers and distances involved in reaching China, discouraging Roman merchants from attempting the journey themselves. Whether this is true or simply Roman bias against a long-time enemy is difficult to say. What is certain is that very few Romans ever reached China, and very few Chinese ever reached Rome, despite the fact that goods flowed regularly between them. The first recorded Roman embassy to reach China arrived in 166 CE during the reign of Emperor Huan of Han. Chinese records describe the arrival of envoys from Dakin, their name for Rome, though the records note that these envoys arrived from the south by sea, suggesting they may have been merchants posing as official ambassadors rather than genuine representatives of the Roman emperor. The Romans knew of China as Serica, the land of silk. They had vague ideas about where it was and how it was governed, but accurate information was scarce. Similarly, the Chinese understanding of Rome was limited and often fanciful. Chinese sources describe Dakin as a land of marvels, with palaces of crystal, trees that produced gold and silver, and other fantastical elements mixed with accurate observations. This mutual ignorance is striking when we consider the sophistication of both civilizations. The Roman Empire and Han China were the two greatest empires of their age, roughly comparable in population, territorial extent, and cultural achievement. Yet they remained largely mysteries to each other, knowing each other primarily through the goods they traded and the second-hand accounts of intermediaries. The Kushan Empire, which flourished from the 1st to 3rd centuries CE, controlled a crucial section of the Silk Road, including parts of modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, northern India, and portions of Central Asia. Founded by the Yuezhi, the same people that Zhang Qian had been sent to find centuries earlier, the Kushan Empire became fabulously wealthy from Silk Road trade. The Kushan Emperor Kanishka I, who ruled from approximately 127 to 150 CE, was one of the great patrons of Buddhism. Under his reign, Buddhism spread along the Silk Road, carried by merchants and monks who travelled the same routes as commercial caravans. This spread of Buddhism is one of the most significant cultural developments associated with the Silk Road. Buddhism had originated in northern India in the 6th century BCE with the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. Initially, Buddhism spread gradually within India, but it remained relatively localized for several centuries. The Emperor Ashoka, who ruled most of the Indian subcontinent from 268 to 232 BCE, converted to Buddhism and sent missionaries to spread the faith, but it was the Silk Road that truly made Buddhism an international religion. Buddhist monks travelled east along the Silk Road, establishing monasteries in oasis cities. These monasteries served multiple purposes. They were centres of learning and spiritual practice, certainly, but they also provided hospitality to travellers, served as repositories of knowledge, and became wealthy landowners. Merchants often donated to monasteries, both out of genuine piety and for the practical benefits of having allies along the trade routes. The Buddhism that spread along the Silk Road was primarily Mahayana Buddhism, which emphasized the bodhisattva ideal, the concept of enlightened beings who postpone their own final liberation to help others achieve enlightenment. This form of Buddhism was perhaps better suited to the diverse commercial culture of the Silk Road than the more austere Theravada tradition. Buddhist art along the Silk Road shows fascinating cultural blending. The earliest representations of the Buddha in human form, as opposed to symbols like a footprint or empty throne, emerged in the Gandhara region of modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, an area that had been influenced by Greek culture following Alexander the Great's conquests in the 4th century BCE. These Gandharan Buddhas have distinctly Greco-Roman features and wear robes reminiscent of Greek togas. As Buddhism spread eastward, these artistic styles travelled with it, but they were transformed by contact with Central Asian, Chinese, and eventually Japanese and Korean artistic traditions. By the time Buddhism reached China in the 1st century CE, it had already evolved significantly from its Indian origins. The Chinese initially had difficulty understanding Buddhism. Its concepts of reincarnation, karma, and the illusory nature of the phenomenal world were quite foreign to Chinese philosophical traditions, which tended to be more concerned with proper social relationships and governance than with metaphysical questions about the nature of reality. Early Chinese translations of Buddhist texts used Taoist terminology, which sometimes created confusion. Despite these initial difficulties, Buddhism gradually took root in China. The period of disunity following the fall of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE actually helped Buddhism spread. With Confucianism's association with the collapsed Han government, there was more openness to alternative philosophies. Northern China was ruled by various non-Chinese kingdoms, some of whose rulers were quite receptive to this foreign religion. Chinese pilgrims began travelling to India to study Buddhism at its source and to obtain authentic texts. The most famous of these pilgrims was Xuanzang, who travelled to India in the 7th century CE, spending 17 years there before returning with hundreds of Buddhist texts. His journey became the basis for one of China's most famous novels, Journey to the West, though that fictional account, written in the 16th century, bears only a loose relationship to the historical Xuanzang's actual travels. These Buddhist pilgrims left valuable records of their journeys. Faxian, who travelled to India in 399 CE and returned by sea in 414 CE, wrote a detailed account of the kingdoms he passed through, their rulers, their customs, and the state of Buddhism in each place. These accounts provide some of our best information about life along the Silk Road during this period. The spread of other religions along the Silk Road is equally fascinating. Christianity reached China by the 7th century CE, brought by Nestorian missionaries. Nestorianism was a form of Christianity that emphasized the distinction between Christ's human and divine natures. It had been declared heretical by the Council of Ephesus in 431 CE, and many Nestorians fled east beyond the reach of Byzantine authority. The Nestorians established communities along the Silk Road, and in 635 CE they reached the Tang Dynasty capital of Chang'an. The Chinese emperor received them favourably, and a Nestorian monastery was established. A stone stele erected in 781 CE, known as the Xi'an stele, describes the arrival of Nestorianism in China and its early history there. This monument, rediscovered in the 17th century, provides fascinating evidence of religious diversity in Tang Dynasty China. Manichaeism, another religion that spread along the Silk Road, was founded by the prophet Mani in the 3rd century CE in the Sasanian Empire. Manichaeism combined elements from Christianity, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism into a dualistic system that saw the universe as a battleground between light and darkness, spirit and matter. Despite persecution in many regions, Manichaeism spread both east and west along the Silk Road, finding followers from North Africa to China. Judaism also had a presence along the Silk Road. Jewish communities existed in many Central Asian cities, and by the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE, there was a significant Jewish community in Kaifeng in eastern China. The origins of this community are unclear, but they likely arrived via the Silk Road. This religious diversity is one of the most remarkable aspects of the Silk Road. In cities like Samarkand or Kashgar, you might find Buddhist monasteries, Zoroastrian fire temples, Nestorian churches, Manichaean meeting houses, and later mosques and synagogues, all coexisting in relative peace. This tolerance was partly practical. Merchants from different religious backgrounds all brought trade and wealth, but it also reflected a cosmopolitan culture that valued exchange and diversity. The Sasanian Empire, which succeeded the Parthians in 224 CE, continued and even expanded the role of Persia as a central link in the Silk Road network. The Sasanians were Zoroastrians, who saw themselves as the restorers of Persian glory after centuries of Parthian rule. They were also shrewd merchants and skilled diplomats who understood the value of trade. Sasanian art and culture influenced regions far beyond their political borders. Sasanian silver vessels, decorated with hunting scenes and royal imagery, have been found from Japan to Scandinavia. Sasanian textiles, featuring distinctive patterns of medallions with paired animals or hunting scenes, were highly prized and widely imitated. These textiles influenced artistic traditions across Eurasia. The city of Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital located on the Tigris River in modern Iraq, was one of the largest cities in the world during this period, with estimates of its population ranging from 200,000 to 500,000 at its peak. The city's great arch, the Tak Khazra, still stands today, a remnant of the magnificent audience hall of the Sasanian kings. Trade under the Sasanians was carefully regulated and taxed. The empire maintained a network of roads, bridges, and caravanserais. Merchant guilds were organized and registered with the government. This bureaucratic approach could be cumbersome, but it also provided a degree of predictability and security that merchants valued. The Sasanians competed with the Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the east, for control of trade routes and political influence. The two empires fought numerous wars between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE. These conflicts disrupted trade, but they also created opportunities for intermediaries and for alternative routes. When the direct route through Sasanian territory became too dangerous or expensive, merchants might divert through the Caucasus region, or they might ship goods by sea through the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. This maritime dimension of the Silk Road is sometimes overlooked, but it was always important and became increasingly so over time. Ships sailing from ports in southern China, such as Guangzhou, could reach Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and even East Africa. These maritime routes were in some ways safer and more efficient than the overland routes, though they had their own dangers, storms, pirates, and the challenges of navigation without modern instruments. The goods traded by sea were often different from those traded overland. Bulk goods that were too heavy or cheap relative to their value to justify the cost of overland transport could be shipped by sea. Spices from Southeast Asia, for instance, were primarily traded by sea, so were certain types of timber, ceramics, and metals. Part 3. The Tang Dynasty and the Golden Age. If there was a golden age of the Silk Road, it was during the Tang Dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 CE. The Tang brought political stability and territorial expansion, extending Chinese control deep into Central Asia. At its height, the Tang Empire was one of the largest and most powerful in the world. The Tang capital, Chang'an, was the largest city in the world during this period, with a population estimated at around 1 million within the city walls and perhaps another million in the surrounding metropolitan area. The city was laid out on a precise grid, with broad avenues and clearly defined districts. It was a cosmopolitan metropolis where merchants, monks, and travellers from across Eurasia could be found. In the markets of Chang'an, you could purchase goods from every corner of the known world. There was silk, of course, in countless varieties and colours. There were spices from Southeast Asia and India, precious stones from Central Asia, glassware from the Byzantine Empire and Persia, horses from Fergana, carpets from Samarkand, and countless other goods. The city had districts where foreign merchants lived, some following their own laws and customs under the supervision of their community leaders. The Tang government maintained a relatively tolerant policy toward foreign religions. Buddhist monasteries flourished, but so did Nestorian churches, Zoroastrian temples, and Manichaean meeting houses. The emperors understood that tolerance was good for business, and business brought wealth and power to the empire. Tang control of the Silk Road reached its peak in the mid-7th century under Emperor Taizong and his successor, Emperor Gaozong. Chinese armies defeated the Western Turks, establishing protectorates over the Tarim Basin and extending influence as far west as Sogdiana. For a brief period, Chinese power reached its greatest westward extent. However, Tang control was challenged by the rising power of the Tibetan Empire and, more significantly, by the Islamic Caliphate. The Battle of Talas in 751 CE, fought between Tang forces and the Abbasid Caliphate in what is now Kazakhstan, resulted in a Tang defeat. While not necessarily decisive in military terms, this battle marked the limit of Tang westward expansion and the beginning of increasing Islamic influence in Central Asia. According to tradition, among the Chinese prisoners taken at Talas were skilled papermakers, and their knowledge spread to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe. Whether this story is true or not, paper, a Chinese invention, did spread westward, revolutionizing record-keeping and literacy wherever it went. The Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled from 750 to 1258 CE, had its capital at Baghdad, founded in 762 CE. Baghdad quickly became one of the world's great cities, a center of learning, commerce, and culture. The city was strategically located near both the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, making it a natural hub for trade between east and west, north and south. The Islamic world's position on the Silk Road was complex. On one hand, Islamic conquests disrupted existing trade networks and political structures. On the other hand, once established, Islamic rule often brought stability and prosperity. Islamic law provided a relatively uniform legal framework for commerce across a vast territory, making long-distance trade more predictable. Muslim merchants became increasingly important along the Silk Road from the 8th century onward. Like the Sogdians before them, they established merchant colonies in cities across Asia. By the 9th century, there were Muslim communities in Canton, Guangzhou, and other Chinese port cities. Muslim merchants dominated trade in certain commodities, particularly spices, and they developed sophisticated business practices, including early forms of checks and letters of credit. The Islamic world made tremendous contributions to knowledge during this period, often called the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and other cities preserved and translated works of Greek philosophy and science, made original contributions in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other fields, and served as intermediaries between the knowledge traditions of East and West. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the early 9th century, was a centre for translation and scholarship. Here, works from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and other languages were translated into Arabic, making them accessible to a much wider audience. Scholars from different religious and cultural backgrounds worked together, united by a common pursuit of knowledge. Meanwhile, in China, the later Tang period saw increasing economic development and social change. A monetary economy expanded, cities grew, and a merchant class became more prominent. However, the dynasty also faced significant challenges. Internal rebellions, particularly the devastating An Lushan rebellion from 755 to 763, weakened central authority. Frontier regions became increasingly difficult to control. The An Lushan rebellion was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly, but it certainly killed millions, possibly as many as 13 million to 36 million people, though these numbers should be viewed with caution as they may include population displacement as well as actual deaths. The rebellion severely damaged the Tang dynasty's prestige and power, and while the dynasty survived for another century and a half, it never fully recovered. In Central Asia, the Uyghur Khaganate, a Turkic empire that controlled much of Mongolia and parts of Central Asia from 744 to 840, became an important power along the Silk Road. The Uyghurs were allies of the Tang dynasty, and they played a crucial role in suppressing the An Lushan rebellion. In exchange, they received trading privileges and subsidies from China. The Uyghurs are particularly interesting because they converted to Manichaeism, making them the only state in history to adopt Manichaeism as an official religion. This conversion occurred in the 760s CE, influenced by Sogdian merchants and missionaries. Though the Uyghur Khaganate collapsed in 840, Uyghur culture persisted in the Tarim Basin, where Uyghur kingdoms continued until they were conquered by the Mongols in the 13th century. The Tang dynasty finally collapsed in 907 CE, ushering in a period of fragmentation known as the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. This political chaos disrupted trade along the Silk Road, though it did not end it entirely. Merchants adapted, finding new routes and new partners. The Song dynasty, which reunified much of China from 960 to 1279, never controlled the western regions to the extent that the Tang had. The northern part of China, including the Silk Road terminus at Chang'an, was often under the control of non-Chinese dynasties like the Liao and Jin. The Song focus shifted more toward maritime trade, with southern ports like Guangzhou and Quanzhou becoming increasingly important. Despite this shift, overland trade continued. The Liao dynasty, founded by the Khitan people and ruling from 907 to 1125, maintained trade relations with both the Song and with Central Asian kingdoms. The Tangut people established the Western Xia dynasty from 1038 to 1227 in the Gansu corridor and adjacent regions, controlling key sections of the Silk Road. These were prosperous times for Silk Road cities. Kashgar, Samarkand, Bukhara, and other Central Asian centres flourished as independent city-states or as parts of various Iranian and Turkic kingdoms. These cities developed distinctive cultures, blending Iranian, Turkic, and Islamic elements. Architecture along the Silk Road during this period was magnificent. Grand mosques with towering minarets, madrasas or religious schools with intricate tilework, caravanserais with spacious courtyards and elaborate decoration, and palaces with gardens and fountains reflected the wealth flowing through these cities. Many of these structures still stand today, testament to the skill of medieval builders and the prosperity of the Silk Road trade. Samarkand, under various rulers, became legendary for its beauty and wealth. The city had been important for centuries, but it reached new heights in the medieval period. Its position at the crossroads of routes from China, India, Persia, and the steppes made it a natural hub. Merchants from across Eurasia met in its bazaars. The city of Merv, in modern Turkmenistan, was another great Silk Road metropolis. At its peak in the 12th century, Merv may have been the largest city in the world, with population estimates ranging from 200,000 to potentially over 500,000. The city was famous for its libraries and scholars, and it was an important centre for Islamic learning. The cities of the Silk Road were not just trading posts, but cultural melting pots where ideas, technologies, and artistic styles from different civilizations met and merged. A merchant from Bukhara might dress in Chinese silk, eat from Chinese porcelain, drink wine from a Persian silver cup, and conduct business using Arabic numerals and Indian mathematical concepts, all while speaking Sogdian or Persian and praying in Arabic. This cultural exchange extended to technology as well. Papermaking, as mentioned, spread from China to the Islamic world and then to Europe. Printing, another Chinese invention, took longer to spread but eventually revolutionized Europe. Gunpowder, also from China, reached the Middle East by the 13th century and Europe shortly thereafter, changing warfare forever. The exchange went both ways. Islamic advances in mathematics, including algebra and the decimal system with Indian numerals, reached China. Astronomical instruments and techniques developed in the Islamic world influenced Chinese astronomy. Medical knowledge circulated freely, with physicians from different traditions learning from each other. Agricultural products travelled the Silk Road as well. Cotton, originally domesticated in India, spread to China and westward to the Mediterranean. Sugarcane took a similar journey. various fruits and vegetables were introduced to new regions. The famous oranges of Spain were originally from China, having travelled westward over many centuries. Musical instruments and musical traditions also spread along the Silk Road. The pipa, a pear-shaped lute that became central to Chinese music, was originally from Persia. The rabab, an ancestor of the European violin, travelled from Central Asia to both China and Europe. Musical modes and scales from different traditions influenced each other, creating new synthetic forms. The movement of people along the Silk Road was as important as the movement of goods and ideas. Artisans might travel to where their skills were needed, staying for years or even permanently settling in foreign lands. Slaves, unfortunately, were also traded along the Silk Road, though generally in smaller numbers than in some other trade networks. Princesses married foreign rulers as part of diplomatic alliances, bringing their households and customs with them. This constant movement created a cosmopolitan culture along the Silk Road, particularly in the major trading cities. Multiple languages might be heard in the bazaar. Different scripts, Arabic, Chinese, Sogdian, Uyghur, and others, might be used on different signs. Temples of different religions might stand on the same street. This diversity could sometimes lead to conflict, but more often it led to a pragmatic tolerance. Business, after all, was business, regardless of where a merchant worshipped or what language they spoke at home. Part 4. The Mongol Period. The 13th century brought dramatic changes to the Silk Road with the rise of the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history. Under Genghis Khan, who united the Mongol tribes in 1206, and his successors, the Mongols conquered a vast territory stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. The Mongol conquests were brutal. Cities that resisted were often utterly destroyed, their populations massacred. Merv, that great Silk Road city, was sacked in 1221, and most of its population was killed. Samarkand fell in 1220, though it was treated somewhat less harshly. Bukhara, Balkh, Nishapur, and countless other cities suffered similar fates. Yet paradoxically, once the Mongols had conquered a region, they often brought stability and order. The Mongol Empire, despite its violent origins, became a period of relative safety for travellers and traders. The Mongols maintained security along trade routes, suppressed bandits, and established a system of way stations called yam that provided fresh horses and supplies for official travellers and merchants with proper permits. This period, sometimes called the Pax Mongolica or Mongol Peace, lasted roughly from 1250 to 1350. During this time, travel across Eurasia became easier and safer than it had been in centuries. A merchant could theoretically travel from the Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean without leaving Mongol-controlled territory. The most famous Western traveller to take advantage of this was Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who claimed to have travelled to China and served at the court of Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson. Marco Polo's account of his travels, dictated while he was imprisoned in Genoa after being captured in a war with Venice's rival, became one of the most famous travel narratives in Western literature. Marco Polo left Venice in 1271 with his father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo, who had previously visited Kublai Khan's court. The journey to China took about 3.5 years, passing through the Middle East, Persia, the Pamir Mountains, and the Tarim Basin. According to his account, Marco Polo spent 17 years in China, traveling extensively and serving as an official in Kublai Khan's government before returning to Venice by sea in 1295. Modern historians debate how much of Marco Polo's account is accurate. He omits some details, like Chinese tea drinking or foot binding, that one would expect him to mention if he had really lived in China for nearly 2 decades. Some scholars have even suggested he never went to China at all, instead compiling his account from Persian sources while travelling only as far as the Black Sea or possibly Central Asia. However, most scholars believe that Marco Polo did indeed reach China, though he may have exaggerated his importance and role there, and his account certainly contains errors and embellishments. Whatever the exact truth, his narrative, known as The Travels of Marco Polo or Il Milione, captured European imagination and provided one of the most detailed Western accounts of the East. Marco Polo described the vast extent of the Mongol Empire, the magnificence of Kublai Khan's court, the wealth and sophistication of Chinese cities, paper money, coal as fuel, and countless other marvels. Some of his readers thought he was lying or exaggerating. The nickname Il Milione may have been mocking, suggesting he told a million lies. But his account also inspired future explorers, including Christopher Columbus, who owned a heavily annotated copy. Marco Polo was far from the only European to travel to the Mongol Empire. Franciscan friars, sent by the Pope to convert the Mongols, or at least establish relations, left detailed accounts. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine travelled to Mongolia in 1245 to 1247, reaching the court of the great Khan Guyuk. William of Rubruck travelled to Mongolia in 1253 to 1255, meeting Mongke Khan. Their accounts, written for the Pope and other officials, provide valuable historical information about the Mongol Empire. Going the other direction, accounts of European travellers to China and Mongolia suggest that people from various parts of Eurasia could be found at the Mongol courts. Craftsmen, merchants, soldiers, diplomats, and adventurers from across the known world served the Mongol Khans, creating a truly cosmopolitan environment. The Mongol Empire eventually split into several khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan in 1271, ruled until 1368. The Ilkhanate in Persia lasted from 1256 to 1335. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia persisted in various forms until the late 17th century, though it fragmented much earlier. The Golden Horde controlled the steppes north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea from the 13th to 15th centuries. Despite this fragmentation, the various Mongol khanates generally maintained good relations with each other, at least initially, and they continued to facilitate trade. The Yuan dynasty in China was particularly important for the Silk Road. Kublai Khan encouraged foreign trade and welcomed merchants from across Eurasia. Chinese products, particularly silk and porcelain, were in high demand, and the Yuan dynasty actively promoted their export. However, the Mongol period also saw the continued rise of maritime trade as an alternative to the overland Silk Road. The Yuan dynasty developed China's ports and encouraged sea trade. Arab and Persian merchants established large communities in Chinese port cities. Ships could carry far larger cargoes than any caravan, and while sea travel had its own dangers, it avoided many of the difficulties of the overland route. The Indian Ocean trade network connected East Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. Monsoon winds made this trade possible, blowing ships from west to east for half the year and east to west for the other half. A ship leaving the Persian Gulf in winter, carried by favourable winds, could reach India in a matter of weeks. Waiting for the monsoon to reverse, it could then travel to Southeast Asia and even China before catching the winds back westward the following year. This maritime route became increasingly important, particularly for bulk goods. While silk and other high-value items could justify the costs of overland transport, spices, ceramics, and other goods were better suited to sea transport. By the 14th century, the maritime route may have carried more trade volume than the overland Silk Road, though both remained important. The 14th century also brought catastrophe in the form of the Black Death, the devastating pandemic of bubonic plague that killed perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe and similarly high percentages in many Asian regions. The exact origins of this pandemic are debated, but many scholars believe it originated in Central Asia and spread along the Silk Road. The plague bacterium Yersinia pestis is carried by fleas that typically live on rodents. Some evidence suggests the pandemic may have begun in the early 1300s in the region around Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan, though this remains uncertain. What is clear is that the plague spread rapidly along trade routes. Mongol armies besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in the Crimea in 1346 were suffering from plague. According to one account, they catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, though whether this actually happened or would have been an effective method of transmission is questionable. What is certain is that ships leaving Kaffa in 1347 carried the plague to Constantinople and other Mediterranean ports, from where it spread throughout Europe. The plague also spread eastward and southward along the Silk Road. China's population, which may have been around 120 million in 1200, had dropped to perhaps 65 million by 1400, though war, famine, and other factors also contributed to this decline. The Middle East and Central Asia also suffered severe population losses. The Black Death had profound effects on the Silk Road. It disrupted trade, depopulated cities, and contributed to the collapse of several states. The Ilkhanate in Persia dissolved in the 1330s, fragmenting into several smaller states that warred with each other. The Yuan dynasty in China grew increasingly unstable and was overthrown in 1368 by the Ming dynasty. The Ming dynasty, which ruled China from 1368 to 1644, initially continued the Yuan policy of encouraging trade. The early Ming period saw remarkable maritime expeditions led by the Admiral Zhang He, a Muslim eunuch in imperial service. Between 1405 and 1433, Zhang he led 7 massive naval expeditions to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa. These expeditions were massive undertakings. The fleet for the first voyage in 1405 reportedly consisted of over 300 ships carrying nearly 28,000 men. The largest ships, the treasure ships, were enormous vessels that may have been over 120 meters long, though these dimensions are debated. By comparison, Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, was probably less than 20 meters long. Zhang. His expeditions were not primarily commercial, though they did engage in trade. They were more about displaying Ming power, gathering tribute from foreign states, and collecting exotic items for the imperial court. Giraffes, lions, ostriches, and other animals were brought back to China, along with various goods and representatives from foreign kingdoms. However, after the 7th expedition in 1430 to 1433, the Ming government abruptly ceased these voyages. The reasons are complex and debated, but they include the enormous cost of the expeditions, political opposition at court, and a shift in priorities toward defending China's northern borders against Mongol raids. The ships were left to rot, and it became illegal to build ocean-going vessels of more than 2 masts. This Ming withdrawal from maritime trade was not absolute. Chinese merchants continued to trade, often illegally, and foreign merchants still came to Chinese ports. But the official policy shifted toward restriction and control. The Ming also became less interested in the overland Silk Road. Chinese control of Central Asia, which had been tenuous since the fall of the Tang Dynasty, essentially ended. Central Asia during the 14th and 15th centuries was politically fragmented but often culturally vibrant. One of the great figures of this period was Timur, also known as Tamerlane, who built an empire from his base in Samarkand. Timur claimed descent from Genghis Khan and saw himself as restoring Mongol glory, though his empire was more Turco-Persian in character than Mongol. Timur was a brilliant military commander, but also a devastating conqueror. His campaigns from 1370 to 1405 left millions dead and many cities in ruins. Yet he was also a patron of architecture and the arts. He transformed Samarkand into a magnificent capital with grand mosques, madrasas, and palaces. Architects and craftsmen were brought from conquered territories to beautify the city. After Timur's death in 1405, his empire was divided among his descendants. His grandson Ulugh Beg, who ruled in Samarkand from 1409 to 1449, was more interested in scholarship than conquest. He built an astronomical observatory in Samarkand and compiled accurate star catalogues. Mathematicians and astronomers from across the Islamic world came to study at his court. The Timurid period saw a remarkable flowering of Persian literature and art. Miniature painting reached new heights of sophistication. Poetry, particularly in Persian, flourished. Herat, in modern Afghanistan, became a major cultural centre under Timurid rule. However, by the late 15th century, the Timurid states were weakening, pressured by new powers rising in the region. Part 5. The Early Modern Period and Decline. The 16th century brought new actors and new dynamics to Eurasian trade. The Ottoman Empire, which had captured Constantinople in 1453, controlled Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and the Balkans, placing itself astride many traditional trade routes. The Safavid Empire, established in Persia in 1501, became a major power and a rival to the Ottomans. In India, the Mughal Empire, founded in 1526 by Babur, a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, would grow to control most of the subcontinent. These empires facilitated trade within their borders, and with each other, despite frequent wars. Goods continued to flow along the Silk Road routes, though with increasing competition from maritime trade. The Indian Ocean trade network was expanding with more European involvement. The Portuguese had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, opening a direct sea route from Europe to the Indian Ocean. By 1510, the Portuguese had captured Goa in India and Malacca in Southeast Asia, establishing a string of fortified trading posts. For the first time, Europeans could trade directly with Asia without relying on Middle Eastern intermediaries. This didn't immediately end the overland Silk Road trade, but it began a slow process of decline. Goods that were previously carried overland increasingly went by sea. The Portuguese, and later the Dutch, English and French, developed maritime trade networks that bypassed the traditional Silk Road routes entirely. The Spanish, meanwhile, had established a route across the Pacific. The Manila galleons, which sailed annually from 1565 to 1815, carried Chinese goods from Manila to Acapulco in Mexico, from where they were transported across Mexico and shipped to Spain. This trans-Pacific route represented a new form of global trade that had no historical precedent. Silver was central to this new global economy. Spanish silver from mines in Mexico and Peru flowed to China, where there was insatiable demand for silver as it was used in the Chinese monetary system. In exchange, Chinese goods, particularly silk and porcelain, flowed to the Americas and Europe. This silver trade had profound economic effects across Eurasia and the Americas. In China, the Ming Dynasty was becoming increasingly inward-looking. The Great Wall, much of which was built or rebuilt during the Ming period, symbolized this defensive posture. The government discouraged foreign trade and contact, though it couldn't entirely suppress it. Chinese merchants engaged in extensive trade throughout Southeast Asia, and goods continued to flow in and out of China through both legal and illegal channels. The Qing dynasty, which conquered China from 1644, initially maintained similar policies. However, by the late 17th and 18th centuries, the Qing had expanded Chinese control deep into Central Asia, conquering the Dzungar Khanate and incorporating Xinjiang into the Chinese Empire. This brought the old Silk Road routes under Chinese control for the first time in centuries. However, by this time, the Silk Road's importance had greatly diminished. The great trading cities of Central Asia remained significant regional centres, but they were no longer the crucial links in a global trade network. Maritime routes had become dominant for long-distance trade. The goods that had once travelled overland increasingly went by sea. Russia's expansion eastward across Siberia also changed the dynamics of Eurasian trade. By the mid-17th century, Russian traders had reached the Pacific Ocean. The city of Irkutsk, founded in 1652, became a centre for Russian trade with China and Mongolia. The Kyakhta trade, conducted at the border between Russia and China from the early 18th century, became an important avenue for tea and other goods to reach Russia and Europe. The land border between the Russian and Chinese empires was formalized by the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689, the first treaty between China and a European power. This treaty, negotiated with Jesuit missionaries serving as translators, established boundaries and trade relations. The Kyakhta Treaty of 1727 further refined these arrangements. Tea became one of the most important commodities in this Russo-Chinese trade. Russian demand for Chinese tea was enormous, and caravans carried it from China across Mongolia and Siberia to European Russia. This tea trade represented a vestige of the old Silk Road commerce, carried on when most other trade had shifted to maritime routes. In Central Asia, the 18th and 19th centuries saw the region divided into several khanates, the Khanate of Khiva, the Emirate of Bukhara, and the Khanate of Kokand being the most important. These states controlled sections of the old Silk Road and engaged in trade, but they were increasingly peripheral to global commerce. The cities that had once been cosmopolitan centers of world trade became more isolated. Samarkand and Bukhara remained important regional centers with magnificent Islamic architecture, but they were no longer the crossroads of world civilization. The caravanserais still functioned, but the caravans were smaller and carried less valuable goods. European travelers occasionally visited these regions, leaving accounts that mixed admiration for the architectural heritage with condescension toward what they saw as backward cultures. Alexander Burns, a British officer who travelled through Central Asia in the 1830s, described Bukhara as a city of decay despite its magnificent buildings. The 19th century brought European colonial expansion into Central Asia. The Russian Empire expanded southward, conquering the Kazakh steppes and then moving into Turkestan. The Khanate of Kokand was annexed in 1876. The Emirate of Bukhara and the Khanate of Khiva became Russian protectorates in 1868 and 1873 respectively, maintaining nominal independence but under effective Russian control. The British Empire, expanding northward from India, competed with Russia for influence in Central Asia in what became known as the Great Game. Afghanistan became a buffer state between the two empires, maintaining precarious independence. The British made several attempts to control Afghanistan with disastrous results, most notably in the First Anglo-Afghan War of 1839 to 1842. This colonial expansion brought railroads to Central Asia. The Trans-Caspian Railway, built by the Russians in the 1880s, connected the Caspian Sea to Samarkand and eventually extended to Tashkent. This made travel across Central Asia much faster and cheaper than the old caravan routes. A journey that once took months could now be accomplished in days. Yet paradoxically, the coming of the railroad marked the final end of the Silk Road as a functioning trade network. The routes that had connected east and west for over 1,500 years were now bypassed by modern transportation. The cities that had once thrived on Silk Road trade became colonial backwaters or regional centres of limited importance. The 20th century brought further changes. The Russian Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent establishment of the Soviet Union transformed Central Asia. The ancient khanates were abolished and replaced with Soviet republics. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara were preserved as historical monuments, but also modernized with Soviet apartment blocks and factories. The Silk Road itself became the subject of romanticized nostalgia and scholarly study. Archaeologists and historians began systematically exploring the ancient sites along the routes. The Mogao caves near Dunhuang, with their treasure trove of manuscripts and art, were studied by scholars from many countries. Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-British archaeologist, conducted several expeditions in the early 20th century, removing thousands of manuscripts and artifacts that are now in museums around the world. In China, the Communist Revolution of 1949 brought the Silk Road regions under firm government control. Xinjiang became the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, though the autonomy was more nominal than real. The old Silk Road cities continued to exist, but they were now part of a socialist planned economy, their role as trading centers largely obsolete. The Cold War divided Eurasia into competing blocs. The Soviet Union controlled most of Central Asia, while China pursued its own path. Travel along the old Silk Road routes became difficult or impossible for most people. The region that had once been the crossroads of world civilization became a strategic frontier between rival powers. Part 6. Legacy and Modern Revivals. The Silk Road's legacy extends far beyond the trade routes themselves. The cultural, technological, and biological exchanges that occurred along these routes shaped world history in profound ways. Consider the spread of religions. Buddhism's transformation into a world religion occurred largely through its spread along the Silk Road. Mahayana Buddhism, which developed in part through the synthesis of Indian Buddhism with Central Asian and Chinese thought, became the dominant form of Buddhism in East Asia. Without the Silk Road, Buddhism might have remained primarily an Indian religion. Christianity's expansion eastward also depended on the Silk Road. Nestorian Christianity reached China by the 7th century and maintained communities there for several centuries. While Christianity ultimately did not take root in China during this period, the fact that it reached so far east and that Christians and Buddhists and Muslims could coexist in Silk Road cities demonstrated a level of religious tolerance unusual for the medieval world. Islam's spread into Central Asia and eventually to China also occurred along Silk Road routes. Muslim merchants established communities throughout Asia, and many Central Asian peoples converted to Islam between the 9th and 14th centuries. Today, countries like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan are predominantly Muslim, a direct result of Silk Road era conversions. The technological exchanges were equally significant. The spread of papermaking from China to the Islamic world and then to Europe was one of the most important knowledge transfers in history. Paper was cheaper and more abundant than parchment or papyrus, making books and literacy more accessible. The printing press, invented in Europe in the 15th century, relied on the availability of cheap paper. The magnetic compass, gunpowder, and movable type printing, often cited as China's 4 great inventions, though actually the 4th is usually listed as papermaking, all spread westward along the Silk Road or related trade routes, fundamentally changing Western civilization. Agricultural transfers were also crucial. Crops like rice, cotton, and citrus fruits spread to new regions along the Silk Road. Techniques of irrigation and water management were shared. The Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the Americas after 1492, was in some ways a continuation of the Silk Road pattern of biological and cultural exchange, though on an unprecedented scale. The Silk Road also facilitated the spread of diseases, as mentioned earlier with the Black Death. But disease transmission, while often devastating, also had long-term effects on human evolution and society. The repeated exposure to diseases from different regions may have contributed to the development of immunities. the demographic catastrophes caused by pandemics like the Black Death reshaped societies and economies. The very idea of long-distance trade, of goods travelling thousands of kilometres from producer to consumer, was established by the Silk Road. The economic concepts and practices developed by Silk Road merchants, letters of credit, merchant associations, standardized weights and measures contributed to the development of modern capitalism. The cosmopolitan culture of Silk Road cities, where people of different languages, religions, and ethnicities mingled and traded, foreshadowed the globalized world we live in today. The tolerance and pragmatism that characterized many Silk Road cities at their best, even if not always maintained, provided a model for multicultural societies. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in the Silk Road. UNESCO has designated many Silk Road sites as World Heritage Sites, recognizing their universal cultural value. Tourism to Silk Road cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Xi'an has grown as people seek to connect with this historical legacy. More significantly, China has launched the Belt and Road Initiative, announced by President Xi Jinping in 2013, explicitly invoking the Silk Road as inspiration for a vast infrastructure and economic development program. The initiative aims to build roads, railways, ports, and pipelines connecting China with Europe, Africa, and beyond, creating what China calls a Silk Road economic belt and a 21st century maritime Silk Road. This modern initiative is ambitious in scope, involving over 60 countries and potentially affecting over half the world's population. Whether it will succeed and what its long-term effects will be remains to be seen. Critics point to debt burdens on participating countries, environmental concerns, and geopolitical tensions. Supporters emphasize economic development and improved connectivity. Regardless of one's view of the modern initiative, it demonstrates the enduring power of the Silk Road as a historical symbol and the continued relevance of the regions it connected. The idea of linking East and West, of creating prosperity through trade and cultural exchange, retains its appeal more than 2,000 years after Zhang Qian set out on his mission. The study of the Silk Road has also evolved. Early Western studies often focused on the movement of goods and emphasized Western sources. More recent scholarship has incorporated sources in Chinese, Persian, Arabic, Sogdian, Tibetan, and other languages, providing a more balanced and nuanced understanding. Archaeologists continue to make discoveries along the Silk Road. In the Tarim Basin, naturally mummified bodies dating back nearly 4,000 years have been found, some showing evidence of contact between East and West, even in prehistoric times. DNA analysis of these and other remains is revealing complex patterns of human migration and mixing along the Silk Road routes. The famous Tarim mummies have features suggesting European ancestry, some with reddish or blonde hair and Caucasian facial features, yet buried in what is now China. This has led to much speculation and some controversy about early population movements across Eurasia. Whatever the exact story, these finds confirm that the Silk Road routes were paths of human migration long before they became formalized trade routes. Climate studies have revealed how environmental changes affected the Silk Road. Periods of warmer, wetter climate in Central Asia corresponded with prosperity and expanded settlement. Periods of drought and cooling led to abandoned cities and disrupted trade. Understanding these climate patterns helps explain the rise and fall of various Silk Road civilizations. The languages spoken along the Silk Road were tremendously diverse. Indo-European languages like Sogdian and various forms of Persian, Turkic languages, Sino-Tibetan languages including Chinese, Semitic languages like Arabic, and many others were all used. The linguistic landscape was complex, with multilingualism common among merchants and in cosmopolitan cities. The scripts used were equally diverse: Chinese characters, Arabic script, various Aramaic-derived scripts including Sogdian and Uyghur, Brahmi scripts from India, and others were all employed. Some languages were written in multiple scripts. Multilingual inscriptions and documents were common, reflecting the multicultural nature of Silk Road society. The art produced along the Silk Road shows fascinating hybridization. Buddhist art in Central Asia combined Indian, Persian, Chinese, and local elements. The distinctive style of Gandharan art, with its Greco-Roman influences, evolved as it spread eastward. Islamic art in Central Asia incorporated pre-Islamic Iranian traditions and influences from China and India. The famous blue and white porcelain, today considered quintessentially Chinese, actually reflects Silk Road exchange. The cobalt blue pigment used for decoration was imported from Persia. The decorative motifs sometimes show Islamic influences. This iconic Chinese product was thus created through cross-cultural exchange. Similarly, Persian carpets, famous worldwide, incorporated motifs and techniques from various traditions. The intricate patterns often showed Chinese influences, particularly after the Mongol period, when contact between Persia and China intensified. The art of carpet making itself may have spread from Central Asia to various regions. Music and dance traditions along the Silk Road also showed extensive borrowing and fusion. The Chinese pipa, as mentioned earlier, derived from Persian instruments. Indian musical concepts influenced both Persian and Chinese music. The dance traditions of Central Asian peoples incorporated elements from many cultures. Even cuisine was affected by Silk Road exchange. Noodles, which appear in various forms in Italian, Chinese, and Middle Eastern cuisines, may have spread along the Silk Road, though the exact origins and paths of transmission are debated. Spices from India and Southeast Asia transformed cuisines across Eurasia. Tea from China became central to cultures from Japan to England, though by very different routes and in different forms. The very concept of restaurants, public establishments, where one could purchase prepared food, may have originated in China and spread along trade routes. The caravanserai, providing food and lodging to travellers, was a precursor to modern hotels. The bazaar or marketplace, a permanent structure housing many merchants and craftspeople, evolved along the Silk Road into sophisticated commercial institutions. Banking and financial services also developed along the Silk Road. The need to transfer funds across long distances led to the development of instruments similar to modern checks or letters of credit. Merchant networks provided informal banking services, allowing a trader to deposit funds in one city and withdraw them in another. These practices were later formalized and elaborated in both the Islamic world and in Europe. Insurance, or at least risk-sharing arrangements, also emerged to address the dangers of long-distance trade. Merchants might form partnerships where profits and losses were shared, distributing the risk of any single venture. caravans travelling together provided mutual protection. These cooperative arrangements were essential to making long-distance trade feasible despite the many dangers. The impact on women's lives along the Silk Road varied greatly by culture and time period. In some societies, women could be merchants, control property, and exercise considerable autonomy. In others, they were more restricted. The spread of different religious and cultural traditions along the Silk Road sometimes meant the spread of different gender norms and expectations. Some women travelled the Silk Road. Princesses sent as brides to foreign rulers brought large retinues with them, introducing new customs and fashions to their adopted homes. Some women merchants engaged in trade, though they were a minority. Female religious figures, Buddhist nuns or Christian women in religious communities, sometimes travelled for pilgrimage or missionary work. The silk industry itself relied heavily on female labour. Sericulture, raising silkworms, was often women's work in China and elsewhere. The weaving of silk cloth was also frequently done by women. Thus women, though often invisible in historical accounts focused on merchants and rulers, were central to the Silk Road economy. Slavery existed along the Silk Road, though its forms and scale varied. Enslaved people were traded, particularly skilled artisans or attractive individuals destined for elite households. Some slaves were prisoners of war, others were purchased or kidnapped. The treatment of slaves varied enormously, from those who achieved positions of some power and influence to those who suffered brutal exploitation. The environmental impact of Silk Road trade and settlement is an area of increasing study. The establishment of cities and agriculture in arid regions required sophisticated water management, but also stressed fragile ecosystems. Deforestation for fuel and building materials changed landscapes. The introduction of new crops and animals to different regions had ecological consequences. Climate change, particularly desertification in Central Asia, has been linked to both natural climate cycles and human activity. Some abandoned Silk Road cities were victims of environmental degradation, either drying up of water sources or advancing sand dunes. The ecological history of the Silk Road regions is complex and not yet fully understood. The end of the Silk Road as a functioning trade network did not mean the end of the regions it connected. The cities continued, adapted, and evolved. The peoples who had facilitated Silk Road trade carried on their lives under new political and economic systems. The monuments built during prosperous times remained, though many fell into disrepair. In the 20th and 21st centuries, some Silk Road cities have experienced revival. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva in Uzbekistan have restored their magnificent Islamic architecture and promoted tourism. Xi'an in China has capitalized on its Silk Road heritage and its role as the location of the famous Terracotta Army. Kashgar, despite modernization that has altered much of the old city, still maintains a large bazaar and some traditional neighborhoods, yet tensions remain. In Xinjiang, the Chinese government's policies toward the Uyghur population, including the reported detention of hundreds of thousands in re-education camps, have been widely criticized. The Uyghurs, whose ancestors played such an important role in Silk Road history, face restrictions on their language, religion, and culture. In Central Asia, the post-Soviet states struggle with economic development, governance challenges, and the preservation of cultural heritage versus modernization. The region, so central to world history during the Silk Road era, remains strategically important but economically peripheral in the modern globalized economy. Afghanistan, site of ancient Bactria and home to crucial Silk Road routes, has endured decades of war and instability. The magnificent Buddhist statues at Bamiyan, carved into a cliff face in the 6th century CE and representing the blending of artistic traditions along the Silk Road, were destroyed by the Taliban in 2001. This act of cultural destruction was condemned worldwide and highlighted the ongoing threats to Silk Road heritage. Yet there are also positive developments. International cooperation in preserving Silk Road heritage has increased. Archaeological work continues to uncover new aspects of Silk Road history. Digital humanities projects are making Silk Road texts and artifacts more accessible to researchers worldwide. Museums around the world display Silk Road artifacts, educating new generations about this historical network. The Silk Road has captured popular imagination beyond scholarly circles. It appears in literature, film, and art. The very phrase Silk Road evokes romance, adventure, and cross-cultural exchange. It serves as a powerful metaphor for globalization, for the benefits and challenges of connecting diverse peoples and cultures. In an era of renewed nationalism and ethnic tensions in many parts of the world, the Silk Road's history of cosmopolitanism and cultural exchange offers an alternative vision. It reminds us that the world has been interconnected for millennia, that civilizations have always influenced each other, and that prosperity often comes from openness rather than isolation. Of course, we should not romanticize the Silk Road too much. It was never a utopia. Exploitation, slavery, warfare, and cultural conflict existed alongside tolerance and exchange. The Silk Road was created and maintained by human beings with all their virtues and flaws. But at its best, it demonstrated what humans can achieve when we connect with those different from ourselves. The merchants who braved deserts and mountains, the monks who carried their faith to distant lands, the scholars who translated texts between languages, the artists who blended different traditions, the rulers who facilitated trade and protected travelers, all contributed to something larger than themselves. They created networks of exchange that enriched civilizations across Eurasia. As we face our own global challenges in the 21st century, climate change, pandemics, economic inequality, political conflict, the Silk Road's history offers lessons. It shows us that different cultures can coexist and benefit from each other. It demonstrates the importance of trade and exchange in creating prosperity. It reminds us that the problems we face, disease, environmental change, the movement of peoples, are not new but have been challenges throughout history. The Silk Road also reminds us of impermanence. Great cities rose and fell, powerful empires came and went, trade routes that seemed permanent for centuries eventually faded away. Nothing in human society is unchanging. Adaptation and resilience have always been necessary for survival and prosperity. Yet, despite the disappearance of the Silk Road as a functioning trade network, its legacy endures. The cultural achievements, the technologies, the ideas that spread along its routes continue to shape our world. The very landscape of Eurasia was transformed by Silk Road era developments. The genetic heritage of modern populations reflects the migrations and mixing that occurred along these routes. In academic circles, Silk Road studies has become a thriving field, bringing together historians, archaeologists, linguists, art historians, and scholars from many other disciplines. International conferences on Silk Road topics attract participants from around the world. New methodologies, from DNA analysis to satellite imagery, are providing fresh insights into old questions. The digitization of Silk Road manuscripts and documents is making these materials accessible to researchers who could never have seen the originals. The Mogao Caves manuscripts, scattered across institutions worldwide, can now be studied together through digital repositories. This democratization of access is transforming scholarship. At the same time, on-the-ground archaeological work continues. New sites are discovered, excavated, and studied. Conservation efforts attempt to preserve fragile remains for future generations. The deserts and mountains that once seemed forbidding now yield their secrets to modern technology and patient research. The story of the Silk Road is ultimately a human story. It's about people seeking opportunity, whether economic, spiritual, or intellectual. It's about curiosity, the desire to know what lies beyond the horizon. It's about courage, facing tremendous dangers for potential rewards. It's about creativity, adapting to new circumstances, and blending different traditions into something new. It's also about community and connection. No merchant travelled the entire Silk Road alone. It required cooperation across enormous cultural and linguistic divides. It required trust between strangers. It required the building of institutions, from caravanserais to merchant guilds to diplomatic protocols that made exchange possible. The Silk Road was never just about silk, just as it was never just one road. It was a complex, evolving network of routes and relationships that connected most of the Eurasian landmass for over a millennium and a half. It was a space where East met West, where North encountered South, where different peoples and cultures interacted in countless ways. As we've travelled through this history together over the past 2 hours, we've seen the rise and fall of dynasties, the founding and abandonment of cities, the spread of religions and technologies, the movement of goods and ideas across vast distances. We've witnessed human ingenuity and adaptability, but also conflict and suffering. The Silk Road reminds us that history is not simple or linear. It's complex, multifaceted, and full of unexpected connections. A decision made by a Chinese emperor could affect merchants in Persia. A religious movement in India could transform culture in China. A technological innovation in one region could spread across continents and change civilization. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can imagine the long caravans of camels crossing the desert, the magnificent cities with their bazaars and temples, the monks copying manuscripts in remote monasteries, the merchants arguing over prices in multiple languages, the scholars translating texts by candlelight. All of this happened, and in happening, shaped the world we live in today. The Silk Road story is part of all our stories, regardless of where we live or what our ancestry might be. The interconnected world we inhabit, the technologies we use, the foods we eat, the ideas we take for granted, all have roots that reach back to the exchanges that occurred along these ancient routes. And so, as we close this episode of Sleepless History, rest well knowing that you are connected to this grand historical tapestry. The Silk Road may be gone, but its legacy lives on in our globalized world, in the artifacts preserved in museums, in the monuments still standing in Central Asian cities, and in the genetic and cultural heritage of millions of people across Eurasia and beyond. May your dreams carry you along those ancient routes, through oasis cities and over mountain passes, across deserts under endless stars, to places where different worlds met and created something remarkable. Sleep well, and thank you for joining me on this journey through time.